What to do with the UK's most dangerous terrorists?
Would you like to hang around with terrorists? I know we're criminals, but, you know, it's not very nice, is it?
Tonight, the government tells our UK editor they want to send more to prisons within prisons to keep them away from other impressionable inmates, but it's a dilemma.
By separation, do you actually make the position worse? Do you end up creating a college of criminality? Or by not doing it, do you allow that person to proselytise and influence other prisoners, some of whom have had no connection with terrorism in the past?
The Justice Secretary also admitted that some terrorists are simply beyond reform. Also on News at 10 tonight. Jab and ride the vaccination drive at a theme park as the pingdemic reaches new heights. Third warmest, fifth wettest and eighth sunniest. How 2020 and the last week alone has shown us an inconvenient truth. Climate change is already here. Plus,
Luke was a good friend and I convinced him to go to Afghanistan, and sadly he didn't come back.
British troops are leaving Afghanistan but won't ever forget those who never did. And
Bonjour. Guten Tag.
the comedian turned children's author, creating characters she never saw when she was growing up.
This is ITV News at 10 with Nina Hossain.
Hello, good evening. It is a big dilemma for those in charge of locking up Britain's most serious terrorists. Allow them to mix with other prisoners and they'll twist the minds of more impressionable inmates to their own evil way of thinking. Or lump them together in a prison within a prison and create a hothouse of dangerous beliefs and deadly ideas. After our exclusive report yesterday from inside one such separation centre, we asked the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, how committed the government was to using them. He wants more convicted terrorists to be housed inside them. He defended de-radicalisation schemes in jail, but admitted there are some terrorists who can never be reformed.
Friday afternoon, and prayers are observed among those who've pursued a criminal calling. Full Sutton is one of two high-security prisons we've gained unprecedented access to, where the imams join the effort to get terrorists to seek redemption.
Do you come across offenders who say, I'm sorry for what I've done, that they do feel guilty?
Definitely. There are many individuals who I have personally encountered who are really guilty of the crimes. They admit it and they are very remorseful as well.
They wish they hadn't done it?
Yes. I came across a person who said he prays every night for the person that he harmed before he prays for anyone else.
Aside from the divine, we are here to see other interventions. Among the prisoners queuing for lunch are terrorists who must be de-radicalised, but also those at risk of seeking similar sustenance. Have you ever noticed terrorists trying to radicalise other prisoners?
Yeah, I've seen it, yeah. If you're in jail, you'll notice things. Would you like to hang around with terrorists? I know we're criminals, but, you know, it's not very nice, is it?
These were what were found behind the cell when they did the cell search.
Staff are being trained to find what prisoners try to hide.
18. Adolf Hitler, well done.
They aren't just looking for signs of Islamist radicalisation, but those enticed by the rise of the far right.
The far right is integral now to disengagement and de-radicalisation inside prisons and outside of prisons. There's been quite a significant rise in extreme right-wing terrorism and extreme right-wing radicalisation. It forms probably about a quarter of the work that we now have to fulfil.
Some minds are so disciplined they cannot be cracked. But those who are willing have put on one-to-one programmes with mentoring and therapy, as well as religious guidance and appropriate reading. This psychologist works one-on-one with the most hardened terrorists in Britain, She doesn't want to fully reveal her identity. She's never been interviewed before.
What are some of the difficult conversations that you're kind of having?
I think some people are worried that what they've done will suddenly lose its meaning. It's been for nothing. So if you've got, I don't know, 40-year sentence, you need to convince yourself it was for something.
How do you know if someone's genuinely engaging in what you're trying to do with them?
We have access to prison intelligence. We look at how trustworthy they are as an individual. Have they got a track record? And a lot of the conditions that drove their risk could re-emerge in 3 months from now. So even if they're telling the truth now by saying I want to desist from from terrorism, that might not be the case in 3 months.
As has been proven before, terrorists reoffend less often than other criminals, but when they do, it is at huge cost. Usman Khan claimed to have been de-radicalised shortly before he killed 2 people at Fishmongers Hall. Sudesh Aman had been on similar programmes in prison before he stabbed several in Streatham. And Brustam Ziamani was still behind bars when he attempted to kill a prison officer, the first terrorist attack carried out inside a British jail.
So I'd like to get up to Full Sutton and Franklin.
Following our filming at those prisons, the Justice Secretary was keen to answer for the schemes that others are questioning.
4 terrorists went on to commit further offences, further attacks within 7 months. That doesn't sound like a success.
Well, look, I accept that this is a very difficult quandary for us. Do we do nothing? Do we just let them sit there and foment their hate? Or do we try and intervene? I think the instinct is the right one, to try and intervene and to try and engage and to do something constructive.
They can game the system. They can pretend that they're reforming when they're not. That is a problem with it, isn't it?
This is difficult work, and there will be people who are genuine and there will be people who are not genuine. And it's the job of the system to try to work that out to our best ability.
The least compliant, those at risk of radicalising others, can be sent to separation centres like the one we filmed at Franklin. But only 1/3 of these cells are being used. The government wants to increase that.
There were 5 terrorists in those cells. Out of hundreds of terrorists in the prison population, it feels as though it's quite a half-hearted approach, isn't it?
Here's the real balance for us. By separation, do you actually make the position worse? Do you end up creating a college of criminality that is even more intense than what is happening in the mainstream prison? Or by not doing it, do you allow that person to proselytise and influence other prisoners? And that's why I'm committed to reviewing the process to make sure that it is as streamlined and as straightforward as possible.
Do you think there are some terrorists that are just beyond reform?
Yes.
But even they can ultimately be released. Time can only hold terrorists for so long before they must decide how they'll spend it on the outside.
Look, it's clearly a difficult dilemma for the government, how to deal with such dangerous people. Why are they considering putting more of them in these separation units?
Well, what the government's had to think really carefully about here, Nina, is when you separate terrorists, you also elevate terrorists. You afford them this greater status by putting them in these separation centres where they can mix with like-minded extremists, potentially radicalise one another further. That's certainly one problem we did see on the ground at HMP Franklin, where we filmed, where the likes of the Manchester bomb plotter, Hashim Abedi, we understand, is free to socialise in that separation centre with the likes of a former Taliban fighter, for example. And tonight, the radical hate preacher, Anjem Choudhury, has put out a statement in response to our reporting. We're always cautious about giving him airtime, but he makes an interesting point that when he was in one of these separation centres, the inmates refused to talk to staff. And again, that's something we verified when we were in Franklin. Some of the inmates were refusing to engage in the prison regime. But I understand the Ministry of Justice has reviewed these separation centres and concluded several things. Firstly, it does want to continue with them. It feels as if there are terrorists beyond reform. You may as well put them into these separation centres. And secondly, it wants to make it easier to do that. At the moment, the bar is quite high if you want to move a terrorist from the general prison population into one of these separation centres. So potentially terrorists inside these separation centres might not feel quite so separated in future, because I think there's going to be a lot more of them.
Paul Brand, thank you very much. Thank you. If you haven't been self-isolating recently, you probably know someone who has. Last week, a new record was set by the COVID Alert app. Nearly 700,000 people across England and Wales heard their mobiles ping with advice to stay at home. More than 500,000 others were phoned by Test and Trace with instructions to do the same. That's 1.2 million people altogether. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak said today the government would still not bring forward the isolation rule change scheduled for the 16th of August.
Most are here for the ride of their life. Others for the vaccine that might save their life. Thorpe Park in Surrey was offering jabs to thousands of people today in the hope the young will come forward. With only 60% of under 30s immunised, health officials are trying anything.
As a young person, it's really hard to commit to a time or, get to a vaccination centre. Not everyone, has easy access to transport to drive and stuff.
The vast majority of COVID cases are now in the young. 27-year-old Mark didn't think twice about getting vaccinated. He doesn't have COVID, but he is isolating. He and his stepmum were pinged 3 days ago and has had to close their restaurant.
We had our COVID test. Everybody came back negative. And it's just a shame, really, because both my parents, they both have their jabs ready. So they both have 2 jabs. Me and my brother, we both have 1 each. So it's really shameful that even though we're the jabs, we still have to shut down the restaurant.
In England and Wales, the latest figures show 689,000 people were pinged by the NHS COVID app for being near a positive case. That's a record high, up 11% in a week. Separately, more than 500,000 people were contacted by Test and Trace in England, up 25%, a total of 1.2 million notifications in just a week.
Hi, I'm Rishi.
Some key workers are now exempt, and soon the double jabbed will also just be asked to test, not isolate, but that's not changing until mid-August.
I think it's the right approach as we exit the restrictions to do so in a cautious way. I know it's frustrating, please stick with it. It's just a few more weeks and then we can, as I said, all look forward hopefully to a very good summer.
Ending automatic isolation, though, does come with some risk.
If we are taking up a lot of testing as an alternative, we may pick up more infections in the population. That is a possibility. But I think, will we see a rise in genuine infections that put others at risk as a result of that new model? There, I'm not so sure, because I think the vaccines do provide very good protection.
If the risks then are so small, it raises the question, why not make the changes right now? Emily Morgan, News at 10.
I'm joined now by our new Deputy Political Editor, Anushka Asthana. It sounds like the government is determined to stick to this original date of August the 16th.
Yeah, I mean, the question that we've asked them, and I've put to ministers and members of the cabinet, is why, if you're going to let people who are double jabbed not self-isolate anyway on August the 16th, why not bring that date forward? And what they say to me is that public health experts in government have said that date is important because they believe that these weeks will allow us to get hospitalisations just down that bit further. The date was originally chosen because it was just after the projected peak of this wave. Now, the numbers do look better than that, so why not change it? Someone today said to me that it's still quite uncertain, it's still early days, and they believe that, as you say, it will stay at that date.
And in the meantime, what are they planning to do?
Well, they're really, really worried because of those eye-watering numbers that you've put out there about particularly critical industries. So areas like food depots or transport hubs or prisons, for example. And so the government has said that they're going to set up 2,000 testing sites in those critical industries where key workers can get tests every day if they've been pinged and still go to work. But there's a couple of issues. First of all, as of tonight, we're told that only 260 out of those 2,000 are actually up and running. Now, we do hope to get higher numbers tomorrow. But also, one person who was quite senior in a relevant industry said to me, they're really worried about how to motivate people to do it. This is voluntary. A lot of people will get paid whether they go to work or whether they stay at home. And there's not really a carrot here because all this scheme gets you is the chance to go to work. Outside of work, you've still got to self-isolate.
Yeah, indeed. Anushka Asthana, thank you very much. Thank you. In another sign of life returning to a bit more like normal, the number of people on the furlough scheme has dropped by 500,000. New figures show 1.9 million people, were still furloughed at the end of June, the lowest level since the start of the pandemic. Young people are moving off the scheme the fastest. For anyone who thought global warming was something that affected other faraway countries, there was a warning today from our own meteorologists. It's already here. The new normal is 0.9 degrees warmer than 30 years ago and 6% wetter. Last year was the third warmest, fifth wettest and eighth sunniest on record for the UK. And meteorologists say this is only going to continue. 40-degree temperatures in British summers are likely to become regular, and that's only if we manage to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius.
Weather has always had a wild streak, but as the world warms, we are being routinely forced to rewrite our record books. Pick your season and you'll find the extreme events are getting longer, warmer, wetter, hotter and colder. Flooding in London last week left a dirty stain on lives and livelihoods. Louise Bellamy studies climate change and had just moved into her new home when she became a victim of a climate-related event.
Well, a lot of books and electricals and a lot of personal belongings that have just completely gone to waste.
Those behind today's report warn of the need to act now.
It's not happening somewhere else in the world, it's happening here on our doorstep. And we'll need to adapt to a changing climate, but we also need to take action now to mitigate against climate change, to reduce the amount of warming, extra warming that we're likely to see both here in the UK but elsewhere in the world.
This year's crop is looking healthy, but the outlook for decades to come is less certain. And that means that farmers may have to adapt. Environmental changes require solutions, and some in farming sense opportunity to play a part.
A number of farmers are trying now not to plough but to use non-inverted tillage to try and retain nutrients and organic matter in the soil. And we're actively looking to engage with carbon markets, perhaps planting trees, but at the moment it's probably underdeveloped.
Hundreds of millions are being spent building defences against the impact of climate change. But are officials doing enough? And when you see, hear, read, speak to government ministers about, opening up new coal mines or not reducing the carbon emissions quickly enough, do you hammer it home with them?
I think we're seeing a huge effort from the government in the run-up to COP26. But I think it's all of us need to understand the pace at which we need to make these changes and act as quickly as we can on those decisions.
Many argue we're not keeping up. Climate change is happening now, and the world's reaction is still deemed to be far too slow. Rupert Evelyn, News at 10.
Most of the secondary schools in England that are eligible for the government's summer catch-up programme have signed up, almost three-quarters. That's nearly 3,000 schools, but the scheme only involves pupils from the past year's 6 and year 7. Millions of others from different age groups won't benefit from the extra lessons to make up for the disruption caused by the pandemic. British military involvement in Afghanistan is coming to an end, but the pain and loss it involved is not. More than 450 British lives were lost in the war against the Taliban. In the second report in our series, Afghanistan Photo from the Front Line, we examine the impact on the comrades of one member of C Company 3 Para who did not come home. Luke McCulloch had already been killed in action 2 weeks before this picture was taken in 2006.
Back then, a nation mourned the fallen of that faraway conflict. Their sad return home a regular feature on the nightly news. The years have passed, but not the pain of those touched by a controversial war. The deaths of soldiers like Luke McCulloch continue to impact not only their families, but those who served with them. Luke, an Irish Ranger attached to 3 Para, had been based here at Sangin, an outpost that came under daily attack from the Taliban. His comrades recall the assault that took his life.
A mortar landed no more than 10 metres behind me, and the shrapnel just took off in different directions. I couldn't see because of the dust. My hearing had completely gone. I couldn't hear anything. I knew there was screaming, but I looked down. Whenever the dust started to clear, I looked down and my desert combats were all red.
It is an image Trevor Coult will never forget. The blood was not his own. Colour Sergeant Richard Spence also lives with the memory of that day and the young soldier he'd persuaded to go to Afghanistan. Spence, who's now retired, was himself badly injured in the same attack.
At our base guess, about 20 mortar bombs fell within about 2 minutes. I got picked up off the ground, thrown through the air, some considerable distance.
He recalls a desperate helicopter evacuation under fire, during which Luke McCulloch died.
We had no time to strap in, and we were literally rolling about the fuselage with the tail gunner, engaging as many enemy targets as he could. And as we climbed the altitude, I remember glancing over before I got into the seat. The medic giving a wave off that indicated that Corporal McCulloch perhaps had made it. And it was a very difficult period, not only because of the contact, but when you're on a Kazivac helicopter with some of your own soldiers who are wounded, and you're in the role of platoon commander, and you know one of the soldiers has died in front of you, in front of their colleagues and in front of you, and you convinced them to come on the tour. All those things hit you pretty quickly. And as we flew back to Bastion, we just remember glancing over once in a while, hoping that they could revive Luke, and perhaps they were mistaken. And then you just couldn't look anymore. You just looked out of the... Sorry. Yeah, I've never spoke about it before. Luke was a good friend, and I convinced him to go to Afghanistan, and sadly he didn't come back.
Do you wrestle with your role in encouraging Luke to go to Afghanistan?
Every day, because you always ask yourself that question, what if I'd have done this instead of doing that? And that's just a burden you just have to have. And I don't think anything will ever change it.
What happens to that burden over the years? Does it change or not?
No, for me it doesn't change. Sometimes as you get older it becomes worse, because you think, you know, where would Luke be now in his life?
So many years on, but those painful questions and the memory of a good friend lost never go away. Emma Murphy, News at 10.
In the next report in our series, we'll hear from Luke's mother. That will be next week. In the meantime, on our website, there are plenty of articles linked to that picture of C Company. That's at itv.com/photo from the front line. Some parents with 3 children aged 3 and under feel a sense of achievement if they manage to get dressed before lunchtime. Rower Helen Glover managed a little more than that in the pairs final in the Olympic rowing in Tokyo. She and teammate Polly Swan, a junior doctor, just missed out on a medal and came 4th. On even choppier water, there was silver for Britain's Mallory Franklin in the canoe slalom.
The rush of Team GB medals slowed a little today. Unlike the white water, Mallory Franklin had to negotiate on her way to silver. Franklin was leading the canoe slalom until the very last run, but world champion Jessica Fox edged her out, although Franklin seemed happy enough with her 2nd place on the podium. Matt Coward-Holly took bronze for Britain in the trap shooting. His ambitions to be a professional rugby player were ended by a serious back injury a decade ago, and he has since reinvented himself as an Olympic medalist.
and the British are charging down.
It was a disappointing day on the rowing course, and especially heartbreaking for Emily Craig and Imogen Grant, who missed out on bronze in the women's sculls in a photo finish. Double Olympic champion Helen Glover, along with Polly Swan, also finished fourth. Glover, who was chasing a third gold in successive games, announced afterwards she was finally putting away her oar.
For me, I just want to be kind of spending time with my children, and you know, after Rio I was done. Now I'm definitely done. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of my rowing career put to bed.
The track and field events get underway here at the Olympic Stadium tomorrow. Headlining for Team GB, of course, the athletics captain Dina Asher-Smith. For gold in the 100 or 200 metres, she will likely have to run a personal best, but she certainly is feared by a world-class field because of her big race mentality. World Athletics boss Seb Coe told me he believes Asher-Smith is in with a good chance of gold.
Not just because she runs well and she runs quickly, but she's also got that inestimable asset, which is she looks good and she's comfortable in a championship environment.
There was a scare in the Olympic Village today when a US pole vaulter tested COVID positive. As a result, an Australian he'd been training with and 2 others are now also in isolation. It was a reminder of how an Olympics under the cloud of COVID is a precarious business. Steve Scott, News at 10, Tokyo.
X Factor, ITV's talent show flagship that launched 1,000 new faces, won't be back on our TV screens anytime soon, if at all.
Nothing's fine, I'm torn.
Among those new faces, One Direction and Little Mix, of course. ITV said today there are no plans for another series. Simon Cowell won't be disappearing, though. He'll be the lead judge on a new musical game show for ITV. Finally, like many disabled people growing up, the comedian Rosie Jones saw no one who looked like her on television or in the books from her childhood. They certainly weren't the main character. As an adult, she set about changing that. Her first book about an 11-year-old with cerebral palsy like her is out soon. Rosie told us she hopes it will boost the confidence of disabled children everywhere.
Hello, bonjour. Guten Tag. My name is Edie Eckhart.
Edie, the book's heroine, has cerebral palsy and is funny, mischievous and confident. She's precisely the kind of 11-year-old Rosie Jones wanted to read about at school.
I love books, but I never saw a disabled character. I never saw anybody that I could relate to. So even from a young age, I thought, I want to write something so that other boys and girls don't feel alone.
On stage, she likes to preempt what the audience might be thinking.
As you can tell from my voice, I suffer from being northern. It's so hard.
And though at school she says she didn't suffer much abuse, she still had to learn how to take the power away from the bullies.
People would shout to me, Rosie, you got a funny walk. And I will go, yeah, I do.
Representation is getting better, but there is still a long way to go.
My dream is for an 11-year-old disabled person to read my book, and in 10 years it gives them the confidence to be whoever they want to be.
Her book is published next week and she's already started on the follow-up.
And I am having the best summer ever.
Nina Nanar, News at 10.
Brilliant. That was News at 10. Thank you for being with us tonight. Hope you will be here again tomorrow. Until then, good night.